Hello and welcome back to the channel, and thank you for joining me in one of my videos. So today I want to show you some correspondence. This is correspondence between a lady called Veronica Chapman and the Portsmouth Council. And this exchange of letters, I think, shows how ridiculous the situation is with council tax. The premise of this is really that Veronica received, like everybody does, a demand from a council, a corporation, for money. Now, a demand, is it not? And you want to say, well, hang on a minute, okay, why do I owe you this money? Where's the evidence? And that's really all that Veronica is asking for, and saying, look, I'm happy to pay if you can send me an invoice. And this exchange is absolutely fascinating and fantastic. So I can't read all of it. It's going to take forever and you'll soon get bored. So what I want to do is to make the document, and I've agreed with Veronica that we can make the document, all the personal information has been redacted, available on the website. And I'll put a link in the description. Now, let me just say something about my links at the moment on YouTube, because they are being a bit awkward with me. I've been banned 4 times now. I've had 4 bans. I've been demonetized or defunded or unable to earn any money from the adverts, as you can see. And now they're even making the links difficult for me, because even if I put the links in and say you've got to cut and paste them, if they're quite long links, they shorten them anyway, so they don't even work when you cut and paste them. So I'm using tiny URL links, which do go in, but you still have to copy and paste them into a browser. If you do want to support the show, look further down in the description, and there are ways that you can support the show to keep it going. So I'm just going to read you little bits from this, and I think you'll find the whole document amusing. At the end of this whole business, however, the council has left Veronica alone, and she hasn't had to pay council tax. And you'll see partly the reasons why this, but you may want to study the documents yourself at your own time. So let's have a look, and we'll start here with a little bit of background information, which I shall read to you. Before reading the following exchange of communications, it's essential that you understand a few fundamental truths. Number 1, governments can always make as much money as they would ever need via their treasury. One cannot authorize someone else to do something that one cannot do oneself. Therefore, if a government can authorize banks, financial institutions to create money in the form of loans, then the government must be able to create money itself. Thus, there is never any real need for any form of taxation. This was proven in 1860 when the U.S. Treasury of Abraham Lincoln created U.S. Treasury note known as greenbacks, and further proven in 1914 when the U.K. Treasury of Lloyd George created U.K. Treasury notes known as Bradburys. Number 2, the collection of council tax is entirely fraudulent. The magistrates' courts are hired for the period such that the magistrate can rubber stamp hundreds of liability orders on an industrial scale. The courts are hired using the court's film dairy, the dairy that must be used, for example. I think that should say diary. That's me saying dairy. The BBC. So, for example, by the BBC, when they want to shoot a courtroom scene for a play, when the council rent the facilities in the same manner as the BBC, the hearing takes place with as much validity as a courtroom scene in a BBC play. This can easily be proven. Upon the receipt of a council tax liability summons, if one rings up the court with a query, one will be referred to the council. The court will know nothing about the case or the summons. The summons will have been printed by the council on their own printers using a letterhead that is a facsimile of the court's letterhead. And 3, let me just raise that up a bit. 3, they will never admit defeat. The best that they can be achieved is their silence. such that they leave you alone henceforth. They will never, never send a letter saying, "Oh yes, you were right after all. Sorry." No so-called authority will ever do that. And that's the thing. It is all theatre. And you're playing along with their acting role. And so let's just start to take a look at some of this correspondence, and you'll see how it goes and how ridiculous and the lengths or the rhetoric that comes out from the council. Because actually, when you ask this one fundamental question, which Veronica does, they cannot answer it, and they cannot send you the item that she asks, which makes their position impossible. And then you see just how vulnerable they really are. So let's go back and have a continuation and see how we go. So as she says here, read on. It started fairly innocently. She first received this, as often we all do, the annual council tax bill. This from Portsmouth City Council, and it's your standard sort of bill. Your reference number and how much you've got to pay. You are not registered to pay by direct debit. It means that you must remember to pay your council tax on or before the due date, the instalment due date listed below. And, it's got the normal schedule and the demand that you get. So it's a demand. So she writes back to the Portsmouth City Council on the 14th of March. This is 2020. Dear sirs, I've received some correspondence from you today. I'm returning said correspondence because it doesn't belong to me. From what I read, I'm not quite sure what the point was. If its purpose was to get me to pay you anything, then you need to send a proper invoice, constructed as per the Bill of Exchange Act 1882, and defining the VAT situation. Absolutely, because any VAT-registered business, and of course the councils are businesses, have to put in what the VAT is. Even if it's zero rated, they still have to do it, which is something that you can, if a bailiff comes to your door with a demand, like anybody with a demand, say, well, what is this? I need an invoice. I want to know what your VAT status is. Because often these bailiff companies, these what do you call them? The enforcement agencies will have at the bottom of their letterhead, they're VAT registered. Well, they ought to be, if they're a business then, sending you an invoice, not just some scruffy bit of paper that says bill and you owe us this money. What does that mean? That's nothing. So let us go back and continue with this fascinating document. So she carries on and says, to be in possession of the important document, such as an invoice, is my right in law, in order to ensure that I am not party to any fraud or money laundering activities. I'm sure you understand. And just to be clear, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not refusing to pay. I'm making an offer to pay conditional on the other party fulfilling their obligation under the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 for this alleged charge. And that's the most important thing. Anyway, you can read this in greater detail. So she's asking for an invoice. So the Portsmouth Council comes back, City Council, says to her, dear Miss Chapman, council tax. The bill that you have received is your annual council tax bill, which we've issued to you every year since the opening of your liability at this address on the 2nd of 3rd, 2016. For each financial year, a billing authority must serve a notice in writing on every liable person in accordance with the regulations and legislation contained in the Local Government Finance Act 1992. Therefore, the bill for £53.19 for the period of the 1st of the 4th, 2020 to the 31st of the 3rd, 2021 is correct. So this is just on one instalment that they want. Please note this bill does not include £71 outstanding, making your total bill £132. Your first instalment was due, and then it goes on to all of that. So basically they're saying this is the liability, your liability rather, is with the Local Government Financial Act of 1992. So she writes back, she writes back to whoever it was, this Louise Chapman. Now, don't get confused by the same surname. Local taxation civic offices in Guildhall. Dear Miss Chapman, I'm writing in response to your letter on the 3rd of April 2020, which appears to suggest that I make some kind of payment. I've already explained to you that I'd be happy to make a payment as soon as I've received a lawful invoice that has been created in accordance with the Bill of Exchange Act 1882, sections 21, 23, 26, paragraphs 1 and 2, and section 91, paragraph 1 and 2, and the current VAT rules. Now, nothing could be a better way of dealing with a company by just saying, send me an invoice. You're a business. Businesses send out invoices rather than just these demand notes. She goes on, consequently, I await the appropriate invoice, and the sooner you comply with the law, the sooner you'll be paid, which is a very sensible thing. She just goes to note for their information, compliance requires compliance with everything. Compliance with the Local Government Finance Act 1992 does not in any way conflict with, and nor does it obviate the need to comply with all other acts of Parliament at one and the same time. So, in other words, you should be sending me an invoice. So she sends this off. She says, I received this 2-page response from the team leader of Revenues and Benefits Department. So this is what they wrote back. Dear Miss Chapman, you have been informed that you are being charged in accordance with the Local Government Finance Act 1992. The collection of the Enforcement Act is covered by the Council Tax Administration Enforcement Regulations 1992. So now they're throwing some legislation back to Veronica. You may claim that you are not refusing to pay a bill for payment and have been correct, which has been correctly issued on the 19th of March under the government legislation. The legislation quoted does not apply to Council Tax Administration, and a further bill will not be issued. If you do not pay in accordance with that council tax bill, it will be necessary to issue a reminder notice. Failure to pay, and then they get into the sort of, right, we're the bully boys here. Failure to pay in accordance with any reminder notice will result in a summons issued to apply to a court for a liability order. And so it goes on. And so we get these sort of the tactics they have. So that was that. Then she writes back to these now slightly threatening letters. And she says, I write in response to your letter of the 23rd of April in which you simply regurgitate the same mantra. The basic fact is you are requesting payment from me. You are requesting I transfer funds from an account held against my name into an account held in the name of Portsmouth Council. You give a reason as the Local Government Finance Act 1992. And I can only think of 3 possible reasons that you are able to demand any payment from me. And she says, and she lists these reasons. If the payment is in exchange for the supply of goods and services, which would be fair enough, would it not? I mean, if you were paying for the bins to be retrieved, the roads to be cleaned, the parks to have amenities, the approval of or disapproval of certain buildings going up by the public, you could say that that's what it is. That's the service, and for that service, you'd get an invoice, wouldn't you? Of course you would. What else does she say? One of the other reasons that they may be trying to extract payment from her is if the payment is a forfeit as a punishment for convicted wrongdoing, which of course she hadn't done any wrongdoing. They weren't saying that. And 3, if the payment is an extortion for being demanded for no reason, but accompanied by threats and menaces. Ooh. That does look like the payment is sort of, we want money from you. We want to bleed you dry. We want to take this money. We're giving you some excuse, and we're not going to send you an invoice. It does look like the council were acting as if it was the 3rd. But let's go on. So which of these is your reason? I.e., Local Government Finance Act 1992. And then she goes on to explain, Is it in exchange for services provided to me by the council, punishment, or is it extortion? Which one? And then she goes into asking and talking about what that could possibly mean. Ultimately, she says at the end of all of that for them, and, you know, we're having to take the council here, or she's having to take it through baby steps to get them understand. I repeat for the final time, if there is no fraud involved, send me a lawful invoice to prove it. The rightfulness of your case should give you no problem at all. So, in due course, they wrote back, Dear Miss Chapman, Council Tax Appeal Stage 2. They've now classed this as an appeal. Every household in Portsmouth has the responsibility to pay council tax. I reiterate that we don't follow any other legislation other than the Local Government Finance Act 1992. The total amount of the council tax that you pay is made up of charges for services, and then she lists the services. The money going to the council is split into two areas, and then it explains what happens to the money and all of that. And then I must inform you that if any appeal is made, it does not give you the right to withhold payment of council tax. So says the team leader of the Revenues and Benefit. So she writes back, and this is where we get into some laughable stuff. Dear Miss Chapman, no, she's writing to the Portsmouth Council. So just, again, don't get confused with the two surnames that are similar. So this is Veronica writing. I write in response to your letter of the 26th of May, in which you seem to have made a number of very serious mistakes. From that letter, it's clear that I am going to have to limit my response to one single point at any one time, because you seem to have the ability to go off on multiple tangents at one and the same time. This will mean that I will be forced to respond with individual letters to each individual mistake on your part. Your first mistake, she goes on to say, the first mistake seems to have made, and therefore is subject to this response, is the heading that you've used, Council Tax Appeal Stage 2. To my very best recall, she said, I have not appealed anything. I have not made any appeal in relation to the council tax. I've not challenged the liability, and nor have I challenged the amount. I have said repeatedly, and here, look at this, I am happy to pay the amount demanded, provided you supply me with a lawful invoice. It's not an appeal. That's simply asking for lawful paperwork. So my questions, which I'm keeping as simple as possible, are: who has appealed the issue, and when did they do it, and who granted them the power of attorney to do it on my behalf? Send me a copy of what they wrote. I have the right to it as disclosure. And then she signs off. You know, you've also made other mistakes. I'll get to those in due time, but the first one is very serious, because someone else is obviously acting at my behalf without my permission. They didn't give up. They wrote back. Dear Miss Chapman, now writing to Veronica, your letter dated the 8th of the April 2020, to which I replied to the 23rd, was treated as your first stage complaint. Your letter to my letter on that date was received on this date, although you have dated your letter whatever. When I replied to this letter, I headed the letter Tax Appeal Stage 2 rather than Council Tax Complaint Stage 2. Please accept my apology for this error. I reiterate, here we get to the main nub of it, I reiterate that your council tax bill is issued under the rules of the Local Government Finance Act 1992, which is statutory demand for payment to be made by yourself, which is not a fraudulent demand. I enclose a copy of your annual bill that was issued on the 13th of March 2020. Even though they said they wouldn't have another bill, they have now issued a bill. The Bills of Exchange Act is not used by local government for purposes of council tax. I will not be corresponding to you any further on this matter, but if you still disagree with my decision, please follow the appeals process. So, here we go. She wrote back again. I write in response of your letter 26th of May, subsequent to the original 30th of May, where I'm asking the following questions. Who has appealed to this issue? And when did they do it? And who granted them the power of attorney? And send me a copy. I have the right for disclosure. So I'm still waiting for those questions to be answered, because on the fact that I know that, based on the fact that I know that I personally did not make an appeal. In your letter on the 26th of May, you refer to the ability of going to court in order to obtain a liability order. Well, if you do, you'll need to explain to the court that I have not made any appeal. I don't think anyone could possibly consider what I have said, namely, for the avoidance of all possible doubt that I am not refusing to pay, to be any kind of appeal. Of course, I mean, how can that be an appeal? Or would it be, or to be any kind of doubt over liability, or any kind of doubt over the amount? Obviously, you need to make this clear to the court and explain that any appeal did not come from me. Now, your second mistake in your letter of the 26th, I mean, this is hilarious. In your second letter of the 26th of May, you say, I therefore conclude that all outstanding balances remain payable and is my final decision. She's highlighting that, of course. And later, if you disagree with my decision, again highlighting. Miss Chapman, how many times do I need to make this clear? She says, I have never asked you to make a decision. All I have asked you to do is to send me an invoice. They can't send an invoice, because if they were to send an invoice, it would mean there would be a contract. You send an invoice on the basis of a contract. Business to business, commerce is done by contracts. The council is a corporation. It's a business. So if it's going to ask for money, it has to issue an invoice. The invoice has to be in relation to a contract, and the contract has to have been agreed and signed by both parties. We, as people who live in houses in towns, have not signed a contract with the council to have a tax or a demand for money taken from us. So they cannot actually send a an invoice, because there is no contract. All they're doing is using a bit of legislation as an excuse to demand money. Well, they might be able to do that if they weren't corporations registered on Dun and Bradstreet, but they are. And so that's why the legislation that they're making and saying we must have this is actually meaningless. But that's what they're pretending, and that's what they stick to. And as you'll see, they cannot possibly admit they're wrong. We move on a little bit further. If says Veronica, however, you wish to consider the decision to be whether or not to sign an invoice, then you could say that your decision, your final decision, was to not send an invoice, which is fine by me, because the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 say that if no invoice is presented, then no debt is outstanding. And in consequence, there is nothing to pay. In plain, simple terms, I owe you nothing if you don't send an invoice. She wrote a follow-up to say, your third mistake. In your letter on the 26th of May, you go to great lengths to explain how you will use the court proceedings to obtain a liability order. Now, this is very interesting, since at no point have I challenged the liability, so this could possibly be considered to be your third mistake. I'm curious as to what you will tell the court. That's why I'm writing this letter. You see, I'm curious as to whether or not you'll attempt to attain your rubber-stamped liability order without explaining the true situation to the magistrate. I'm curious as to know how you'll explain it to them, if at all. I have never once questioned the liability of the funds demanded, so what do you expect a liability order to achieve, over and above the fact that you still do not question the liability? Anyway, she goes on and on about the correct paperwork and all of that. Basically, again, I need an invoice. The response was a rubber-stamped liability order. So that's the order that you get, which comes from the council. So This time, Veronica writes to the borough solicitor at Portsmouth City Council, and she copies in the recoveries officer, which is Louise Chapman in this particular instance. And she says, "Dear Sir, Madam, I write due to the fact that I have had no substantial response to my questions and requests for information which, as a member of the public, it is the duty of the council to provide me. I am still awaiting the answers to the following questions." And we've gone through the questions, really, but she's reinforced them here. Your communication on the 9th of February, broken arrangement and enforcement warning notice, but you have not specified what the arrangement has been broken. In other words, the contract, there is no contract. So first of all, will you specify precisely which arrangement it is your claim that's been broken? You'll need to provide a copy of that arrangement which bears my signature or seal of obligation. In other words, the contract, which they can't because there isn't one. When you've done that, you'll send me a copy of the alleged liability order that you claim you have obtained so that I can verify its authenticity and veracity. This will be in the form of a valid court order. It will contain the legal signature of whoever made the order, i.e. the magistrate, and will contain the court seal. Something else that they cannot possibly provide because it wasn't actually done in a magistrate's court. It was only in a hired court, and it's just a Mickey Mouse piece of paper. The third thing that you'll do is to send me a copy of the prosecution bundle that was used in order to obtain that alleged order. And in particular, I need to be able to check that the makers were informed that I have never refused to make a payment and have only ever requested and waited for the arrival of an invoice. And of course, that prosecution bundle will never have been submitted to a magistrate's court in the first place, only their own fake court. This is all basic stuff, really. Number 4, the fourth thing that you will do is to consider this letter to be a subject access request for any and all internal and external communications that have involved Miss Veronica Chapman or any variation, such as Veronica Chapman, etc. So a subject access request. And finally, where in the Local Government Finance Act 1992 or any other ensuing regulations is the specific exemption to the Bills of Exchange Act 1882, which is an older act, which is very important. So she sends that off, and what does she get here? Sealed sincerely on the right, because I'm always on the right, she says, which is a nice thing. So we now have another letter. We're nearly at the end. And the important part of this bit is she's writing to remind you. So she's not heard anything. I'm writing to remind you I'm still waiting for a copy of the prosecution bundle that was used in order to gain your liability order, which they haven't got. You don't seem to understand the situation. The way the mafia operates is to simply demand money on the basis that if you don't pay up, distressful things will happen to you. The mafia don't dare document their transactions, but claim to provide the service of not doing any distressful things if payment is made. The way your council operates is simply to demand money on that basis. If one doesn't pay, levelling distress would eventually happen. The council don't document their transactions but claim to provide services and refrain from taking any distressful actions if payment is made. So in other words, she is obviously likening the council to the mafia, which I think is quite fair, as we've seen in this series of documents. Do you understand the fundamental similarities? From any reasonable point of view, on the other hand, if Portsmouth City Council did document precisely what services they provide on a lawful invoice created in accordance with the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 and the current VAT rules, there would be a distinction, a lawful and obvious difference between the behaviour of Portsmouth City Council and that of the mafioso. If you do really agree, if you do not understand this, try and look at it from a realistic point of view instead of the common purpose indoctrination. And anyway, she carries on writing several times, but it does seem that in the end, she hears nothing back. And hasn't had to pay anything since then, since 2020. I think this highlights many things. Firstly, with the council, demand an invoice, because they are businesses, as has been reiterated, that they are demanding with menaces and threats. It isn't a legal magistrate's liability order. The councils, as we've seen copious times, are hiring the courts, just as they might do, as pointed out, for a BBC drama. You don't have the right to appear in the court. And if you do exercise that right, and maybe everybody on that list that they send out, and we saw with Portsmouth, I think, with Rob the Rat Catcher, that over 6,000 of them were being rubber stamped in a period of about half an hour. So if 6,000 people had turned up to say, well, I want my day in court, thanks very much, 6,000, however long it would take, every mitigating circumstance, each of those people saying, look, it's not that I have not refused to pay. I would just like to have my day. I would just like to have an invoice, please, for all the services that you say you're doing for me. I don't think that's too much to ask. You're asking for money for these services. What are these services? There is a vague thing about the police and rubbish collection and street lighting and ambulances and things like that. But what exactly? I'd like to know exactly what these services are, itemised, just as I would with any other business that I am with. Because there may be things that I actually disagree with. Maybe you didn't take my bins on a certain day when the bin men were on strike. Maybe the street lights have not been up to service and standard, and that the bulbs were not replaced, and yet you're billing me for them. I would very much like to see it all itemised, and so therefore I can agree and you can agree, it's all happy, and I'll give you the money. And what would be more sensible than that? Clearly, the councils are acting like the mafia and demanding money, and you're only within your right to ask for that invoice. I'm greatly indebted to Veronica for sending in that paperwork and her somewhat humorous, though accurate, letters that she wrote back to them, and then the fact that they just shut up and left her alone. As she said before, they won't tell you that they're in the wrong. They can't, because that gives the game away, because then you could publicly put that onto shows like this or in a court anywhere else, and that would be the end of it. Sorry this has been a slightly longer version, but I hope you got something out of it. Thank you so much for watching.